Hello engineers, my name is Nili and welcome to Satisfactory 101. Today we're discussing manifolds and load balancers in your factory. One of the most fundamental aspects of factory design in Satisfactory. We're going to talk about which is better, which one you should use, and how you can go about improving both. So without any further ado, let's start with my personal favorite, the manifold system, the easiest one. Chances are you've built this before. Simply put, it's a straight line of splitters feeding machines where items flow down the line until all machines are eventually filled and are at working capacity. It's the most straightforward approach to resource distribution in the game. But that also means it has a little bit of caveats. See, the way a manifold line works is when resources enter the manifold, they are split at each splitter by half. They're halved and they continue down the main line, with half going to the machine and the remaining half down the main line. You can imagine the longer your manifold, the more your initial resource lacks as it goes down the line. Now, how can we go about fixing this? Because this is pretty detrimental. There are a couple fixes to this issue, specifically with manifolds. We can use what's called a manifold injection, use slower belts, or switch off production entirely. So let's go ahead and start with the manifold injection and see what that does. All it does is we add a merger somewhere down the line in the manifold and add a new source of the same resource further down the line. This helps saturate those later machines a little faster because remember, the longer the manifold, the less resources they get. But if you go to do this, a load balancer is better. What about improving it by changing out the belts? Well, for your main input line, use the fastest belts you have. That's Mark 5 or Mark 6, and that's the line that's flowing from whatever your source is into the splitters. Out of the splitters, use the slowest belts you have. This means if your machine only needs 60 items per minute, use Mark 1s. This limits how many resources are funneled into each machine, which means subsequent machines fill up in the manifold a little sooner. Now, one of the best optimization tips that I can give is don't start all your connected machine systems at once. You can turn off all your machines or just not select a recipe to start and let the manifold fill initially. Fill those initial inputs and let them completely fill every machine's buffer and power them all up at once. This bypasses much of the saturation delay and gets your factory running at full capacity much faster. Similarly, if you have production stages like smelters feeding into constructors, as you can see, we want to let the smelting line fully saturate before turning on the constructor line. This primes the system for production. As you can see, the build-up means that there's no noticeable delay with it being a manifold. If you didn't choose to do it this way, the constructors would starve because of a bottleneck due to the lack of resources that it's being fed. But that's something that you'll have to balance depending on how big, again, your manifold is and how big the stages in your manifold line are. With something as simple as this, it's easy to let them back up in the first stage and make it more efficient. How about those load balancers? They're a little less easy, but they're the mathematically perfect option. Unlike manifolds, they perfectly split our resources evenly between all machines from the get-go. And the main advantage to this is instant and equal distribution. As soon as you turn on the power, every machine gets exactly the same number of resources. No waiting in line for it to saturate. However, again, there's a big but. They are complicated to design, need to calculate splitter ratios, feed rates, loopbacks, and they can't be expanded at all. Now, there is also some math involved, but I promise it's easy. It's not overly complex, but it does require some planning to make sure the load balancer works. So let's look at the initial setup for one. The easiest balancers to build are ones that are divisible by 2 or 3. However, this is a little nuance, we'll talk about it later. So why 2 or 3? Well, it's because that's how many outputs a splitter has. In this example, we're looking to balance one input into 12 outputs, in this case 12 constructors. Well, 12 can be divided by 2 or 3. By 3 it gives us 4, so 4 splitters. That can be further divided into 2 and divided by itself to give 1. Let's look at it from the top. This means that we have a 2 to 2 to 3 ratio or a 1 to 12 load balancer. This successfully splits all our resources. But what about those weird numbers? That's where we use a loopback. A loopback essentially takes the excess material and feeds it back into the beginning of our system through a merger. For a 5-machine setup, as you see here, we actually designed for 6 outputs. Then that 6th output is the loop back that's come back into the beginning. Essentially, we're building one extra belt for a number of machines that aren't multiples of 2 or 3. So for 7 we build 8, and for 8 we build 9, and so on and so forth. But they won't work properly. Just remember, if they are at max capacity, for example a Mark 5 belt carrying 780 units, that it will be fed up in that loopback if it's also at 780. Let's look at how we can make this a little better. Multiples of 2 or 3 are pretty broad and we should avoid it, because we can't use it for things like 10. So instead, if you need a number of belts for which 2 or 3 are not prime factors, then you don't need a loopback at all, as you saw with 12. But the official Satisfactory wiki does provide us with a odd number of balances chart, which you can see the odd number column on the left is simply just adding an extra 1, and that added number is the number of loopbacks we have. So let's look back at our example of 5 constructors. You can see we have n equals to 5, which is our constructor count, and we have a 6th loopback loop, which just feeds back, and it's the single loopback. That's easy enough, right? Let's take a look at it in a little bit more detail and a little bit more of the math side. Again, this is really easy stuff. Let's say we have 10 machines. Well, 10 divided by 2 is 5. We can't divide that any further, so let's increase it by 1. 11. Still can't divide it by 2 or 3, so let's increase it by 1 again. 12. Now we can divide it by 2 or 3, as we saw in the very first example. If we divide by 2, we get 6, which we can further divide to 2. This works as our result is a 2 or 3. This means that from 10 machines, we added 2 machines to satisfy the rule, which means we therefore add those 2 machines as loopback lines into our original system. Let's take a look at it in the actual game. Here you can see that I've gone ahead and set up 10 constructors with the 1 input. And over on the left there, you can see that I've set up 2 of our loopback lines, which is feeding in from the 1 splitter when we look back at our calculations of 12, which means we have those 2 additional loopbacks in the system. This is great. However, again, remember those limitations that I said before. If your loopbacks are also carrying too many resources that your main belt line can't handle, it will eventually clog up, but this is just one of the many tricks that you have in your arsenal. Now, going into the simplest way, instead of adding a loopback, which is the 6th machine, just add the 6th machine. It's the humble underclock. We add whatever the number of loopbacks is the machine, underclock it respective to what your clock rate should be, and connect it up, and it works flawlessly. And really, that's about it. That brings us to the conclusion of manifolds versus load balancers, and hopefully you've taken something useful away from it. I know there was a lot to go over, but it's some of those core things that Satisfactory is known for. Now, if you did enjoy this video, make sure to throw a like and even subscribe for more Satisfactory videos and tutorials, or even share it to a friend who you think might find it useful. Remember, the beauty of Satisfactory is that there's no single correct approach. You might prefer the simplicity of the manifolds or the complexity of load balancers. Find whichever one makes you have the most fun and go with that. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Thanks again for watching.